All right, so now that we've looked at some graphs that are misleading, and most of the time intentionally misleading, that leads a good way for us to talk about something called bias. So bias is something we need to worry about when doing statistics. So first, let's make sure we understand what bias actually is. So one way to think of bias is some just phrase it as the tendency to lean one way over another. Another longer definition is looking at it as a prejudice either in favor or against something. In a way that's often considered unfair. So we're going to talk about some different types of bias in statistics. And we're also going to talk about then how to avoid them. But the first thing I want to emphasize is what I'm really talking about, bias from what perspective. Everything that I'm going to talk about is going to be from the researcher perspective. What I mean by that is I want to try, as a researcher, not to be biased. However, that's not going to keep people that I'm surveying from having their own bias. So for example, if I were to ask people, what is the best place to go to get the best French fries? I expect people to have their own biased opinion on what they like. What I want to try to avoid is me forcing them to hear a biased side of something before they've even answered it. So we're only talking about it from the researcher perspective. We still expect people to have their own opinions, and I'm not worried about trying to eliminate that. All right, so the three different types of bias that we're going to talk about. The first one is what's called selection bias. And just as it sounds, it's going to be associated with how we select our sample. So let's talk through a couple of examples of selection bias. So for example, maybe I only ask Democrats about their opinions of the president. So, of course, the reason why that would be biased is since the current president is a Republican, I would expect that Democrats are going to have a pretty strong bias against the president. So I'm intentionally selecting people to show a certain opinion. Another example of this would be asking just non-smokers how they feel about a smoking ban in a certain area. Or me trying to find out if I'm a decent professor, only asking the students who got an A in my class, right? I would expect if I only asked my A students how I am as a professor, that they'd probably really like me because they got a good grade in my class. Right, so the selection bias is intentionally selecting people to show a certain opinion. So maybe we want to add here that this is generally intentional. Not something that could happen, but is going to happen. So going back to our president here example, if I only ask Democrats, that's definitely a problem. However, if I were just to sample 50 people, is there a chance I would only get Democrats? Yes, but I'm not intentionally making sure that I only get Democrats. So it's not just something that could happen, it's something that's going to happen. The next type of bias we're going to talk about is response bias. And this is actually associated with how the questions are asked. Now, you're probably expecting for me to say associated with the responses, but if I were to say that, that's a little misleading because, again, I expect people to have a biased answer, but it's what I'm doing as the researcher that would be the problem. So that's why we're saying with how the questions are asked. A couple of different examples that could fall in to this category. So my first example might be me phrasing a question. I'm trying to figure out where people's favorite pizza place is. And so I might say, well, my favorite pizza is Papa John's. What's yours? Now, why would that be a bad question to ask? Well, it's phrased in a way where I've given you my opinion already. So if you don't have another answer in your head, you might say Papa John's simply because I did. So we're putting our own bias into that question. Another example of a question that might not seem so bad might be just simply of, do you use drugs? And although that question by itself, well, one, we don't want to answer right now, but why would that be a bad question? Is if someone were to answer yes, I'm not positive what made them answer yes. Because if I look at just the phrase, use drugs, it sort of matters how you interpret that question. Are we only talking about illegal drugs? Are we talking about prescription drugs? Are we talking about caffeine in the coffee and soda that we drink? So what are we counting as being drugs? And so I leave that very open to the person's interpretation, which gives me some bias associated with the answers that I would get. Examples can come in a slightly different form. And this actually can be how the questions are administered. So for example, am I going to do something online? Am I going to do something on paper? Or am I going to do something face-to-face with somebody? So how I administer my questions can make a difference as well. So for example, if I was asking a very sensitive survey, say maybe something about sexual history, if I ask you to answer those questions online, where it could be very anonymous, or if it's on paper, if it's a mailed survey, maybe very different than if I'm standing right there while you take the survey. First, if I ask you those questions and ask you to verbally answer me face to face, how I administer that could lead to some biased results because of someone either being comfortable or uncomfortable with how that question is being asked of them. Right? If I were to ask you to evaluate my teaching online like you're going to be at the end of the semester, or come to my office and tell me what you really think, I'm probably going to get some very different types of answers. So how we ask the questions, not only the words that we use to ask them, but how we're physically actually asking people to fill out these results is important to think about as well. Finally, the last type of bias that we worry about is what's called non-response bias. And non-response bias is associated with non-responses. that are important to the question. All right, so first important thing I want to write down here about non-response bias. Well, so non-response just means that someone chose not to fill it out. That is not the same thing as a non-response bias. What I know as a statistician is that I can't force people to answer my questions. I can't force you to be part of my study. I cannot control that there's going to be some times that people do not respond. What I need to worry about is if there's a certain group of people important to this question that I'm trying to answer that I'm going to miss out on, that's going to hurt my answers or results that I get. So a couple of examples for those. I'm going to refer to the first one as just what I call a time survey. So what I mean by that, here's a very quick example. So I have kids in elementary school, and they come home with papers all of the time. And suppose one of these papers is a survey about how much time I might have to help in the classroom, or to help with extracurricular activities, or to help with just like printing things for the teacher, helping with classroom parties, all these different things about how much time I would have to help. So who's going to fill out that survey? Are people who have time? Who's not responding? Are those parents that don't have time, the ones that don't even have time to see the survey to fill out in the first place, right? So if all I get are these surveys, they're like, oh, look, everyone has all this time. I can ask for lots and lots of help. Well, you're missing a very important group to your question. If you're asking to figure out how much time parents have to spend on things, this group of people who didn't respond is very important to your question because these people don't have that much time. Another example of a non-response bias are the online evaluations that students take of their professors. Now, not necessarily are all of them going to fall into this category. What could make this a non-response bias? Well, the first thing I got to figure out is who is the most likely not to respond that I do care about, who is important for my question. So what I mean by that, the first most likely group to not fill out the online evaluations are the students who don't come to class. And to be honest, those are not important people for me to really answer my question. Because if I want to know if I am an effective teacher, I don't really need the evaluation of someone who wasn't in class to see if I was an effective teacher. Right, so that's kind of first what I mean by this. Because there's a non-response doesn't mean it's biased. So if I lost those people that didn't come to class, it's not that big of a deal for us because it's not going to help us or basically have us lose any information in our answers. Who do I really worry about not responding for those? Well, let's first talk about who does respond. Usually those students have a very strong opinion about their professor respond to those surveys. So whether you really, really liked the professor or really, really disliked the professor, those are the students who are most likely to respond to online evaluations. So who am I missing? The group that's actually most likely to not respond to the online evaluations are that middle group, the people who think that the professor is okay. They're not great. They're not horrible. They're just okay. And a lot of information can be learned in this middle group of people. Right, that probably really gives me the best idea of how effective of a teacher I truly am, is what this middle group would say about me. So if I lost that information, that's going to be important to my statistical question, and thus would become a non-response bias. So these are examples of the 3 different types of bias. Now, how do I actually go about avoiding bias? Well, the first thing that we try to do is take a random sample. So we're going to take as random of a sample as possible. So try to be fair, try to be objective as possible. Right, so don't intentionally sample certain people that just because they're going to say what you want them to say. As far as the response bias goes, and then somewhat non-response bias, is you have to worry about testing out your questions. So maybe ask people how they interpret a certain question to be, such as the, do you use drugs? So what would you think of when I asked you that question? So I could find out maybe how I need to be more specific in my question. And then also then think about your method of delivery. So how are you administering the survey? So what is the best way to administer a survey in order to make sure that we get honest answers as well as many answers as possible. Finally, some notes about good data. The first thing I want you all to remember is that perfect data, what we all would love to have, seldom if ever exists. No matter how much I try to control certain things, I try to, test my questions, make sure they're asking what I want them to ask. I make sure that I'm not putting any of my own opinion in the question. I've thought about if I should do it online or face-to-face or on a paper survey. I've thought through all these things. I can't control everything. I can't force people to respond to these surveys. It's just not going to be perfect. It's just not going to happen. So the things to keep in mind. 1, know your population. Who are you trying to study? That way you know where your sample needs to be coming from. Do your best to have as random selection as possible when collecting data. And finally, be as unbiased as possible. Again, we're talking from the researcher perspective here. But don't put our opinion on to others. So that makes us talk now about bias. We'll get a dive in next time to actually doing some examples with some graphs and stuff as well.